I don't doubt that you know a lot about popular songs. Let's say you know all there is to know about popular songs. There is just one thing that you're overlooking around. And I shrimped, not knowing that I was going to have a violent eye allergy. And this eye blew up like a balloon, and my eyebrow went up into my hairline, and the eye was closed like that. They laughed on screen, but what happened off it was a very different story. For years, Audrey Meadows kept her silence, graceful, composed, and always the perfect counterpart to Jackie Gleason's thunderous presence. But behind the laughs, behind the applause, something far more complicated simmered quietly. Why did it take her so long to finally speak? What truth had been tucked behind those perfectly timed comebacks? And what moment, buried in the shadows of fame, stayed with her for decades? The answers don't come with drama. They come with clarity. What Audrey revealed wasn't revenge, it was something far more powerful, and it changed how we see a legend forever. Casting clash and first impression. When Audrey Meadows first set her sights on the role of Alice Kramden in The Honeymooners, she faced an immediate obstacle. Jackie Gleason didn't think she was right for the part. Gleason, already a towering star in the early days of television, reportedly dismissed her after an initial audition, saying she looked too elegant and too refined to convincingly play a working-class housewife. His vision for Alice required someone grounded, gritty, and believable as a Brooklyn homemaker, not someone who exuded sophistication or theatrical polish. Unwilling to let that be the end, Audrey took a bold step that would ultimately secure her the role. She hired a photographer to take candid shots of her in an old housecoat with no makeup and messy hair, deliberately presenting herself as tired, modest, and utterly domestic. She then sent these photos to Gleason without identifying herself. When he saw them, Gleason reportedly said, "That's the girl," not realizing it was the same actress he had turned down. Once he discovered it was Audrey, he agreed to cast her. But the tone had already been set. This would be his show, on his terms, and her presence was allowed only because she proved she could fit his vision. Quite early in that contact, it was clear that power dynamics would shape the working relationship they entered into. Audrey was not a passive player. She was smart, experienced, and tactful. But she understood that to fit into Jackie's world, she had to adapt, not insist. Gleason was notoriously territorial about his creative control, blocking scripts and stage blocking. For Audrey, gaining entry meant convincing that she could serve the story, but would not undercut his spotlight. Her decision to conceal herself during that audition was clever, but it was cunning, a silent signal that she understood the subtle politics of working beside a man like Gleason. Though it had a bad start, the casting turned out to be one of the most unforgettable pairings in television history. Chemistry was electric between the two on screen, characterized by Audrey's sharp-tongued wit and calm strength against Jackie's bombastically holding forth in unpredictable energy. Audiences believed in them enough to think they were a real couple. Their dynamic was so believable, it felt lived in. But as Audrey would later reveal, it was not by personal closeness that made it realistic. It was through managing creative tension, starting with the first impression. From that point on, their dynamic was forged in resistance rather than rapport, and it affected everything thereafter on the Honeymooners set. But landing the role was just the beginning. What came next was unlike anything Audrey had prepared for. One-man kingdom on set. From the moment the Honeymooners became a standalone show, it was crystal clear. Jackie Gleason ran the set like a kingdom, and he was the king. As both star and executive force behind the scenes, Gleason maintained near total creative control. He oversaw writing decisions, production schedules, and often refused to rehearse, believing spontaneity made performances funnier. While this contributed to the show's raw, unrehearsed energy, it also created a tense and unpredictable work environment, especially for co-stars like Audrey Meadows. Every decision was filtered through Jackie, making the set feel less like a collaborative workplace and more like a stage for his singular vision. For Audrey Meadows, this dynamic meant she had to walk a very fine line. Although she was deeply experienced and well-versed in comedic timing, she had to make sure her performance supported Jackie's without ever upstaging him. She could be funny, but not too funny. She could be strong, but not dominant. Any attempt to change or question a line, something many actors do in the name of improving authenticity, required Gleason's direct approval. According to crew anecdotes and Audrey's own later reflections, the rule was clear. Only Jackie's voice really mattered. This constant deference to his authority turned every taping into a tightrope act for everyone involved. Jackie's controlling nature was not limited to what was written. He hated rehearsals, so most scenes were shot in one take. If someone flubbed a line, the pressure to hit it was huge, given that it was a one-take scene. You could really cut the tension behind the scenes when Gleason was in the room, recalled cast and crew members. The writers were careful. Directors walked on eggshells. Anyone working opposite him, including Audrey, had to tread very lightly around his moods. Any mistake, be it creative or personal, could invoke the silent treatment, or in rare instances, a real lashing out. In Jackie Land, the motto was second chance. In turn, Audrey remained impeccable, despite all the emotional upheaval. She would arrive on set prepared, deliver every line without a hitch, and never publicly challenge Jackie on anything. But privately, it took its toll. Years later, she would describe it as living on a tightrope, where every prize of creative fulfillment came with an equal share of emotional fatigue. What audiences responded to in measured doses of chemistry and comedic timing were simply her efforts to maintain the facade of Jackie Land, where she served both the art and the ego of its sovereign. Emotional tightrope. Behind the quick wit and sharp delivery of Alice Kramden was an actress constantly navigating a complex emotional landscape. For Audrey Meadows, acting wasn't just about performance, it was survival. Working alongside Jackie Gleason, whose mood could shift without warning, meant that every scene and interaction was a delicate calculation. She had to be responsive, clever, and composed, all while staying attuned to Gleason's temperament. One wrong move could result in being frozen out, criticized in front of the cast, or worse. Her professionalism was praised, but few realized just how much emotional strategy it took to maintain that composure. Audrey knew her role extended beyond the script. She had to support Jackie's explosive style without ever threatening his dominance. Her calm, grounded energy was essential to balancing his unpredictability. But that balance came at a price. According to later interviews and personal reflections, Audrey often felt like she was walking on eggshells. She couldn't outshine Jackie, but she also couldn't fade into the background. Her timing had to be impeccable, her expressions restrained, and her presence strong enough to hold the audience without provoking friction behind the scenes. It was an emotional tightrope that demanded constant vigilance. Yet, despite all this pressure, Audrey did her magic. Her portrayal of Alice was not merely adored, it was quietly revolutionary. She represented a woman who defied, who matched her husband in energy, but never lost her impeccable dignity. Yet in her real life, that same strength became tempered in order to keep peace on set. The best of her famous comebacks, with perfect timing, came from genuine anger, cleverly disguised as humor. Close friends and co-workers said that Audrey would use her acting as a kind of psychological shield. She was able to protect herself emotionally while still giving the audience all they wanted from Alice. What made her way so brilliant is that it was so oblique. Inwardly, she may have been resisting Jackie, but she could never openly say so. Her only voice was her art. Her apparent composure was often mistaken for calm, but internally, she was persevering. Everybody thought it worked because we liked each other. It really worked because we didn't like each other. This idea puts everything fans ever thought they knew about the Honeymooners in a new light. What they were seeing was an act of balancing on a wire. Two performers entangled in the most intense struggle, one fighting with charm and sheer strength, and the other with control and calculated grace. Unspoken friction as fuel. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Honeymooners was the undeniable chemistry between Audrey Meadows and Jackie Gleason. Their dynamic as Alice and Ralph Kramden felt raw, real, and lived in. A working-class couple full of tension, love, and biting humor. But that chemistry wasn't the result of a deep personal connection. In fact, it came from the opposite. As Audrey later revealed in private conversations and late-in-life interviews, the on-screen magic was born from unspoken friction. They weren't close friends. They rarely interacted off-camera unless it was strictly work-related. The tension that audiences believed was performance was in many ways genuine. That real-life distance gave their scenes a crackling energy. Audrey once said, "People think we had chemistry because we liked each other. It worked because we didn't." That insight offers a powerful lens through which to re-watch the show. The sarcasm, the sharp comebacks, and the thinly veiled exasperation from Alice weren't just scripted. They were rooted in very real feelings of frustration and emotional exhaustion. While Gleason's explosive personality could dominate a scene, it was Audrey's restraint, timing, and quiet strength that grounded it. Their performances played off each other like a tug-of-war. He with volume, she with precision. While this dynamic was certainly apparent to audiences, it permeated the souls of the cast and crew. Tensions behind the scenes were often thick because of Gleason's temperamental moods and outright domineering disposition. All the while, Audrey never let any of that affect her professionalism on camera. She perfected the art of emotional restraint, delivering the line with just enough sting to land without shattering the illusion of comedy. One wonders, with some irony, if the heightened tension between this couple was a source of the show's success. Their interactions felt like unscripted living, recognizably familiar to audiences across America, who not only laughed at Ralph and Alice, but actually saw reflections of themselves in the couple. Unbeknownst to the television audience of the Honeymooners, perhaps it was harmony within the creative team that served to exaggerate the realism. Instead, it was constant negotiations of space, ego, and tolerance that were going on. Audrey's brilliance consisted of maintaining composure under pressure, the delivery of cutting lines with a deadpan expression, and enduring the emotional turbulence of working with Gleason. Sure, it was comedy, but underneath it lay serious emotional currents. The same tension that made viewers crack up night after night came home with Audrey when the lights went down. And this double-edged sword, where fiction and reality crossed paths, became one of television's biggest illusions. Temperamental environment. The set of The Honeymooners may have brought laughter to millions, but behind the scenes, it was often a place of high tension and quiet dread, largely due to Jackie Gleason's volatile temperament. His temper was legendary, and not in a flattering way. According to crew members, the entire atmosphere of the set shifted, depending on Gleason's mood. You could feel it in the air the minute he walked in. One crew member recalled, "People stiffened, lowered their voices, and braced for what kind of day it would be." The unpredictability wasn't just exhausting. It shaped every creative and emotional interaction on set. Gleason's resistance to rehearsal made things even harder. He believed in spontaneity, often filming scenes in a single take, regardless of whether mistakes occurred. This approach may have created the raw, unscripted energy that fans loved, but it also increased the pressure on the cast, particularly Audrey Meadows. A missed cue or flubbed line could provoke a harsh outburst, and there was rarely time for a second chance. Even though Audrey was known for her professionalism and near-perfect delivery, she wasn't immune to public criticism. There were days when Gleason would openly reprimand her on set, only to act like nothing happened the next day, an emotional whiplash that made trust nearly impossible. Audrey described the experience as walking on eggshells, wherein she had to be keenly aware, fluid, and above all, composed, no matter what erratic energy surrounded her. Cast and crew quickly came to terms with changes in Jackie's moods. Directors were careful, writers were submissive, and the supporting actors kept a low profile. For Audrey, who prized order, dignity, and consistency, maintaining her cool under such an emotionally charged and unsteady environment came at a great cost. With no formal system set up and little in the way of protections for women in television back then, all she could do was suffer in silence. Audrey's friends later said those years were embedded deep into her mind. Hardly mentioning Jackie Gleason, her tone would shift, tightening a bit, as if she were recalling something painful. While she publicly complimented his enormous talent, her private comments paint a different picture. The laughter flooding into American households during The Honeymooners masked a backstage life strewn with emotional landmines. Audrey did not simply work opposite Jackie. She endured him, and through it all, she kept showing up, prepared to perform, delivering performances that still resonate to this day. Her indomitable spirit in the midst of these chaotic situations is a testimony to her strength, both as an actress and as a person. What happened behind the scenes was draining, but what happened inside Audrey was far more lasting. Emotional toll behind the laughs. To the public, Audrey Meadows was the epitome of poise and wit, always sharp, composed, and seemingly unshakable in her role as Alice Kramden. But behind the polished performances and scripted comebacks, Audrey carried a quiet, emotional burden. Working on The Honeymooners meant living under the shadow of Jackie Gleason's volatile moods, erratic behavior, and total control. While viewers laughed at Ralph Kramden's over-the-top antics, Audrey often braced herself for what version of Jackie she would encounter on set. The stress of that unpredictability accumulated over time, leaving her emotionally drained even as her fame soared. Privately, Audrey admitted to friends and family that the environment was taxing. There were days Jackie wouldn't speak to her between takes, and others when he'd publicly criticize her performance, only to be warm and complimentary the next day as if nothing had happened. This cycle of emotional manipulation and unpredictability created a work culture that was not just difficult, it was psychologically exhausting. Audrey felt pressure not only to deliver consistent performances, but also to manage Jackie's temperament, often absorbing his frustrations in silence to keep the show on track. Her endurance wasn't celebrated. It was expected, not against the emotional weight that Audrey has carried, but her struggles remain hidden from public view. She did not speak badly about Jackie in interviews, maintained a professional countenance at all times, and never used the press to voice grievances. To many people, this self-control would be viewed as weakness, but for her, it was only a survival strategy. In the 1950s, the price actresses would pay for sassing everyone, and not holding back, was that they would be branded difficult people, and find all their movies stalling at a particular point. Audrey wasn't going to let that happen. It wasn't only for Jackie. The myth of The Honeymooners was to be protected for those who cherished the show itself. But maintaining that myth became much more difficult with every passing year. Although long after the show had left, the emotional residue continued to remain. Friends recalled how Jackie could still whip up a change in Audrey's expression, tightening in her face. A momentary pause, as if something that had been hard buried worked its way back to the surface. It has never entirely healed, even though she went on to work on other projects that were much more stable and had a creative input. This was not just a chapter in her career, but also a chapter in her emotional life. Those laughs, as the audience saw it, most of the time came at the expense of her peace of mind. Loyalty versus self-preservation. Throughout her years on The Honeymooners, Audrey Meadows faced a persistent internal conflict. Her loyalty to the show and its legacy versus the need to protect her own well-being. The sitcom had become a cultural phenomenon, and her portrayal of Alice Kramden helped define a new kind of TV wife, sharp, independent, and grounded. But behind the scenes, Audrey was grappling with an emotionally unstable work environment, largely driven by Jackie Gleason's mood swings and creative dominance. Quitting the show might have spared her the emotional toll, but staying meant preserving something she knew was special to millions of viewers. CBS executives understood Audrey's value. They saw her as the grounding force that made Jackie's explosive humor palatable. According to accounts from the time, she was quietly pressured to remain on the show even when the strain became apparent. Chemistry like theirs was lightning in a bottle, one executive reportedly told her. And Audrey, understanding both the opportunity and the risk, made a calculated choice to endure. Speaking out could have cost her career. Walking away could have tarnished the show's reputation. Instead, she committed to the work, even when it came at a personal cost. Audrey's decision to remain silent had elements of fear, but was much more strategic in the long run. The cultural expectations for women in entertainment in the 1950s were to be agreeable and demure. Those who challenged authority were branded as difficult, while many other women faded into obscurity. Audrey understood the code and learned to play it. She gave gracious interviews, praised Jackie in public speeches, and cultivated the genius illusion that all was well behind the scenes. In doing so, she safeguarded the image of the show needing to do so, while she herself was suffering the private torment of mental exhaustion in keeping track of someone else's ego. Only decades later, long into her 70s, did she begin to speak freely about what her silence cost her emotionally. By then, the changing cultural landscape meant that audiences would be more ready to hear from women who had long been relegated to the sidelines or even silenced. But at the peak of her career, she had no such comfort. Her silence had not been weakness. It had been a mechanism of self-preservation. She had remained loyal to the show and its legacy, but the consequences were great. Bottled-up emotions, unprocessed stress, and decades spent repressing a story she was unable to share. In the end, she bore it all in silence, but not without consequence. When silence breaks, truth speaks. It wasn't until Audrey Meadows reached the age of 73 that she finally began to speak openly about her years working alongside Jackie Gleason. For decades, she had kept her thoughts private, protecting the image of the Honeymooners, shielding herself from industry backlash, and honoring an unspoken rule of the era. Don't stir controversy, especially if you're a woman. But in a series of late career interviews, personal letters, and in her memoir, Audrey began to lift the curtain on what had long remained unsaid. Her revelations weren't vindictive or bitter. They were measured, thoughtful, and above all, honest. Audrey described Gleason as both a genius and a deeply difficult man. She acknowledged his brilliance, his ability to light up a room, to deliver unforgettable performances, but didn't shy away from the emotional consequences of working with someone so temperamental. She spoke candidly about his mood swings, his need for control, and the toll it took on her to constantly manage his volatility without ever letting it show. Her insights painted a fuller picture of the man audiences adored, offering a more complex truth that had long been hidden behind laughter and nostalgia. Intercepting the thrust of society's demand for her to lie down and take it, she had chosen to narrate her story. She wasn't out to trash the name of Jackie Gleason. Rather, she wanted to add some depth to the one-sided narrative that had celebrated the dimensions of his greatness for far too long. In doing so, Audrey created her own niche beyond that of Ralph Kramden's loyal and loving wife. She proved herself to be a person in her own right. A woman who for decades had been forced to suffer the consequences of an unkind partnership in silence. All these memories held meaning with clarity and elegance to her. What lingered in Meadows' mind was an unforgettable moment, the last time she spoke to Gleason before he died. That last moment was characterized in Audrey's words as very gentle and very kind, so unlike anything that had existed in the years of tension that covered their relationship. So not quite closure, but peace. I forgave him, she was to say, but never forgot. That understated statement gave her story all the ambivalence it deserved. An acknowledgement that compassion can exist alongside even a painful inheritance. Speaking out at 73, Audrey Meadows wasn't just telling her truth. She was permitting others to tell theirs. Legacy, redemption, and private farewell. When Jackie Gleason passed away in 1987, tributes poured in from across the country. He was remembered as a pioneer of television comedy, the great one whose comedic genius shaped generations. But for Audrey Meadows, his death stirred something far more personal and complex. She attended his funeral quietly and without fanfare. There were no public statements or dramatic moments. Just a respectful, private farewell from a woman who had once been at the center of Gleason's world, both on screen and behind the scenes. Her silence at that moment reflected the tone of their complicated history. Dignified, restrained, but deeply felt. In later conversations, Audrey opened up about that final goodbye. She described feeling an unexpected sense of peace, not because old wounds had healed, but because there was nothing more left unsaid. I forgave him, but I never forgot, she told close friends, a line that would come to define the emotional honesty she had always maintained in private. That distinction between forgiveness and forgetting revealed how deeply she had been affected by the years of emotional strain while filming The Honeymooners. The public saw smiles and chemistry. Audrey had lived through silence, stress, and the cost of loyalty. Yet, even given that emotional toll, Audrey never attempted to tarnish Jackie's legacy. Her subsequent thoughts, shared in her memoirs and hushed interviews, were not meant to diminish his legend, but to provide a counterpoint. She acknowledged his vast talent, but pointed out the emotional toll he took on many, particularly on those like her who worked intimately close to him. By doing this, she gave the fans and historians a more rounded and honest view, not only of Jackie Gleason, but also of the painful toll that supporting someone so brilliant and tyrannical required. Audrey Meadows' decision to speak her truth was a redemptive layer to her legacy. She was no longer just Alice Kramden, the patient, witty wife of a beloved sitcom. Instead, she became a symbol of resilience and clarity. A woman who bore the painful weight of emotional hurt for decades before finally putting it down on her own terms. Her farewell to Jackie would not be bitter. It would instead be one of contemplation, a quiet reclaiming of her story. In so doing, she reminded the world that there are unseen hands and hearts that most often pay dearly to shape a legacy. Audrey's quiet goodbye also displayed a larger generational trend among women in classic Hollywood. Loyalty there was often mistaken for contentment and silence. Equated with professionalism, in stark contrast to several public figures today who instantly voice their grievances on every possible platform, Audrey's restraint and silence, for that matter, testifies to her era. And thus, redemption did not rest on public spectacle, but reflective gradation for her. She held back her remarks until later in life, not as a sign of weakness, but instead to safeguard her dignity as well as the reputation of the show. In a culture that often emphasizes instant catharsis, Audrey reminds us that some truths require both time and dignity to express. Yet sometimes the most powerful closure doesn't come in public. It comes in a private whisper. Final conversation before his death. Audrey Meadows' final conversation with Jackie Gleason offered a rare, quiet moment of peace between two people who had once shared one of television's most iconic yet emotionally complex partnerships. After years of working under immense pressure, enduring his volatile moods, and maintaining a public silence about the emotional toll, Audrey's last exchange with Jackie was strikingly gentle. As she later recounted, Their final talk wasn't filled with rehashing old wounds or dramatic reconciliations. It was calm, warm, and perhaps most surprisingly, kind. In that last conversation, Jackie told Audrey he had always respected her and had appreciated her work. For a man not known for expressing such sentiments openly, those words carried weight. Audrey, who had spent years absorbing emotional strain and silence, received them with grace. The conversation didn't erase the past, but it softened it. According to the METV article, Audrey later described it as a good ending, a phrase that reflected the healing power of that moment. For a woman who had spent so much of her career carefully managing Jackie's energy, the sincerity of his final words mattered deeply. The beauty of this final exchange, in fact, resided in the emotional symmetry which it held. All her life, Audrey had been the calm, stable presence beside Jackie's chaos, larger than life, on screen and off. The very last time they spoke, that same equilibrium could be seen again. Again without the assured greenness, the audience, or power structure. Though just two aging performers acknowledging what was shared through their histories, meaningful, certainly, to both their careers and their emotional lives. What made their last conversation significant was not what was said, but how it was said. With tenderness, with mutual recognition, and perhaps with an unvoiced understanding that each had a part, though essential in the other's story. Audrey didn't want grand apologies or dramatized reconciliations. All she wanted was honesty, and within those final words, she got it. It was a dignified end to a rather complicated chapter, one that had been built on creative brilliance, emotional resilience, and finally, a shared respect that may have taken decades to be spoken aloud. Through the modern lens of today, their last exchange is evocative of how emotional labor, especially in women, before this era, or even a little later, went completely unrecognized and sometimes even forgotten. Nowadays, conversations about emotional labor in the workplace are very much like those in a male-dominated institution, which would echo Audrey's unique experience. Her suppression was not simply personal, but professional survival. That his confession of her worth to him came at the very end of his life provides a small yet deeply potent gesture that counters the long-standing tradition of cherishing brilliance and brushing aside the cost paid by others. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as powerful as we did, don't forget to like the video. Subscribe for more untold moments from TV history, and drop a comment below. What do you think of Audrey's truth? And don't go just yet. Click on the next video on your screen for another behind-the-scenes revelation you won't want to miss.